However, before the Second Battle of Passchendaele, there's news from other fronts. The Russian army has now all but collapsed. The Russian army is now facing a second revolution, and it is clear that the fighting on the Eastern Front is over, and this large, veteran, experienced, confident and victorious German army is now free. The German army gather this army up and they hurl it against the Italians. From the 24th of October to the 20th of December, there's the 12th Battle of the Isonzo, known as Caporetto. The German and Austro-Hungarian armies shatter the Italian army. The Germans capture Caporetto village, and the Italian army is completely broken, turn and they run in their hundreds of thousands towards the bridges over the rivers. Italy is very lucky that Germany had no cavalry on that front. If the Germans had had any cavalry really upon that front, then the Germans could have reached those bridges before the fleeing Italian troops captured the Italian army and forced Italy to surrender. As it was, there was a bit of a race. There was a question of, could the Italians run away quicker than the German army can advance? As you can imagine, this is a real competition. And it turns out the Italians could flee slightly quicker than the Germans could chase them, and the Italian army managed to make it across the bridges. Even so, it is the greatest defeat that Italy suffers in its history. And that's got some pretty steep competition, and it's one of the worst defeats of European history. Italy loses 305,000 casualties, including 265,000 prisoners. The Germans capture over 3,000 guns and advance 65 miles. Rommel, who will of course become famous as a Second World War general, captures 1,500 Italian soldiers with only 2 German soldiers. Russia has ceased to fight. Italy's army is mostly now prisoners of war. The American troops have still not arrived in Europe in any great strength. But the French army is starting to recover. But the British army will have to struggle on. From the 26th of October to the 10th of November is the Second Battle for Passchendaele. The Canadians attack Passchendaele 4 times and finally take the ridge. They had predicted 16,000 casualties to take the ridge and suffered roughly that number. With the fall of the ridge, Haig calls off the Third Battle of Ypres. The next day, British troops are taken out of the line at Ypres and sent off to Italy to prop up yet another failing ally. Overall then, looking at the Third Battle of Ypres, by the time the ridge had fallen, the problems for the French army were over, although French morale was punishingly low. The Germans had sent 88 divisions to fight at Third Ypres, half of all the divisions available on the Western Front. The British army had fought well, but the weather had been awful. There had been a real chance that the Germans would have been forced to abandon the Channel ports. The morale of the German army had been badly damaged. British confidence remained high. But British allies were falling fast, and so the British were to plan for one last push in 1917, the Battle of Cambrai. 10 days after Passchendaele, the BEF Third Army under General Byng was ordered to attack at Cambrai. Now, this has been a quiet area of the front. The ground was unchurned, and so the British were going to experiment with a new way of war, a massed tank assault. They gathered 476 tanks, including 98 support tanks loaded with supplies to support the attack. Now, this was important, but it was the artillery that was going to be seeing the real innovations. It was what we call the first predicted barrage. Normally you had to have ranging shots. You'd fire a gun, see where you hit, and then adapt your aim. This time they're doing what we call a predicted barrage. Now, they worked out that every artillery piece, every gun barrel, fired its shells slightly differently because the gun barrels were worn and they all wore slightly differently. They also worked out that every box of shells went through the air slightly differently. They also worked out that the wind speed, the wind direction, even the humidity could affect how the shells would go through the air. So they dragged the guns back and tested each gun to find out what the deviation of each barrel was. They then tested every box of shells to find out what the deviation of each box of shells was. They got as accurate as they could readings of the weather, and they said that if you're firing this gun with this box of shells, and this is the weather conditions, then you should know that that gun will deviate by this much. This allowed them, once they worked out where the German guns were, the idea was that the British guns would be able to hit the German defences accurately first time, so the Germans wouldn't have any chance to try and pull their guns away from the British barrage. They used aircraft to try and update the maps to make sure they were more accurate. They had developed new, more accurate shell fuses to allow an immediately accurate barrage. Now, the German defences at Cambrai are incredibly thick, but surprise is now possible. Instead of these long preparatory bombardments where day after day the British artillery tried to shatter the German defences, now you can achieve real surprise. Now the British artillery will open up on the Germans only when the British infantry have gone over the top. There will be no warning for the British attack. But despite the lack of barrage, they could come close to guaranteeing that they could cut the wire in time for the British infantry to reach there and keep the German defenders' heads down. Tanks would also be used to crush what wire remained. And so on the 20th of November, at 6:20 in the morning, 1,003 British guns opened up, and as the British infantry go over the top. The British advance 5 miles in a day along a 6-mile front. But there are some failures on that day of success. The Germans managed to keep hold of Flesquien village as a German anti-tank battery drove off the advancing British tanks, stopping the British from taking Boulogne Wood. At day's end, only 217 British tanks were still working. Mechanical failures are still crippling these weapons. But even so, the British push cavalry through the gap, and the cavalry then rapidly capture Marcoing and Magnier, including capturing the key bridges over the canal. The cavalry are making great use of the hole torn in the German lines. It had been a spectacular success, and back in Britain, church bells are rung out in celebration. They had advanced more in 6 hours at Cambrai than they had managed in 3 months during the Third Battle of Ypres.